Hello, Andrew. Hello, Andrew. Can you hear me, Andrew? Hello, Andrew. Can you hear me, Andrew?
The audience can hear me if I speak through this.
Where is IT?
If I speak through this, they can't hear me. The one in auditorium. I'm supposed to use that too.
Hello, Andrew. Can you hear me? Nggak kedengeran? Udah on. Hello, Andrew. Andrew.
Hello.
Yang audience ini.
We are going to start the webinar.
Okay. So we have everybody. We used to expecting more people to enter.
We have most of the participant here, so we can start.
Kedengarannya kayak online, tapi yang offline nggak kedengaran.
Tadi kan bisa kok ini yang kamera itu nggak nyala ya? Nyala ya? Tadi ini pas kita ngomong kedengaran di speaker, sekarang cuma si Andrew doang.
Cuman mereka yang online aja yang kedengaran. Yang di sini tapi kalau
ini bisa nampilin semuanya nggak nih yang di sini? Yang di big screen, jadi si Andrew-nya kelihatan.
Tapi kalau cuma di sini.
Si Andrew doang bisa nggak full screen? Okay, Andrew, can you see everybody?
I can see everybody. Yeah.
Yes.
As soon as I start talking, I'll change the screen to show the presentation.
Okay. So before we start, I guess can everybody wave to Andrew?
Hello.
Okay, so before we start, I'm just going to give a little explanation. This is an informal explanation before the formal opening. So Andrew is in Maldives right now. It has 2-hour difference with us. So now it's what time is it there, Andrew?
It's 12:15.
12:15. Okay. Can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay. So I met Andrew. He was my colleagues on board cruise ship. We worked together for more or less 2 contracts. Am I right?
I think so, yes.
Yes.
A lot of years.
We did a lot of events together. I was a fine dining manager, and Andrew is a very, very talented cellar master on board the ship.
Thank you.
And it was such a pleasure and such a fun journey. And I'm very happy that I can work together again with you. Thank you.
Looking forward to it as well.
Thank you. So I will pass on the mic and the stage to the moderator.
All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. I would like to introduce myself. My name is John. I'm a student of Batam Tourism Polytechnic Semester 2, and I will be the host for the event for today. First, I would like to welcome our director, Mr. Nur A. Nasution, and our vice director, Mr. Agung Edi Wibowo. I would also like to welcome our lecturers and our college students from Batam Tourism Polytechnic in this auditorium and the ones that are at home. And I would also like to give a big welcome to our speaker, Mr. Andrew SAKOWIC. All right. Thank you for coming to this seminar with the title of Introduction to Wine. I hope everyone is healthy, physically or mentally. To begin the event, I would like to invite the Vice Director, Bapak Agung Edi Wibowo, to open the event and give a speech. To Bapak Agung Edi Wibowo, the stage is yours.
Thank you, John. First of all, I want to say thank you to God for blessing us that we have today now. So we are able to together in here making a webinar with title Introduction to Wine. Good afternoon, Nur, as a director of BTP. And of course, good afternoon too for Andrew SAKOWIC, our respected speaker today. Sitting here, I am Agung Edi Wibowo as a vice director in BTP. Want to say a little thing such as a opening speech. Thank you to you all in here because you have time, but you can spare your time to go to here to listen and to attend this seminar. I wish you all a great webinar and hopefully we will gain so much more about knowledge of wine. And thank you very much for listening and attending this moment. And of course, I give back the microphone to the moderator and the seminar will be begin. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the opening speech, Mr. Agung Edi Wibowo. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker. As you know, our speaker for today is Mr. Andrew SAKOWIC. He is a globally experienced hospitality leader and sommelier. He has Wines and Spirit Education Trust Level 3, Advanced Wine and Spirit. He has Wine and Spirit Education Trust Level 2, Intermediate Wines and Spirit. He is also Court of Master Sommelier Level 2, Certified Sommelier 2017. That's all the brief introduction for our speaker. And now I would like to give the stage to Mr. SAKOWIC.
All right, John, thank you very much for the lovely introduction. And I would like to say hello to all of you and thank you very much for participating and inviting me to share some of my knowledge and passion for the wine with you today. We'll have quite a bit of fun. I think the session will run for maybe just over 1 hour, and then we'll have also some time for questions and answers. So for anybody who is participating online with us, so please, if you would like to ask any questions, maybe put them via chat, and John, our moderator, will collect those questions, and at the end we'll have the question and answer time, and we can answer all those questions you may have. For those ones who are in the hall, I'm sure there will be an option for you to ask the question personally, which will be great. So we'll keep all the questions at the end, and we can start with the presentation. But before I will actually kind of fully introduce myself, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. I want to actually start with a little question for you. Of course, I know you cannot directly answer me, but I want you to just kind of quickly think about it and what it could actually mean. And the first question is, if you ever heard of this word, which is on the screen. I hope everybody can see the screen. And this is a word called aenophobia. And what is it? Well, aenophobia is actually an actual illness. It's a fear of wines, and there are people in the world that actually suffer from it. Even just thinking of wine or hearing about wine gives them anxiety. I think none of you have this illness here because you wouldn't be here. I think it's a little bit more uncommon, but what's quite common is that people are actually they are actually a little bit more intimidated and scared of wine, maybe not just to hear about the wine, but actually to learn from it. It's a big subject. People study wines for years, and you can never really know everything about the wine. It's a knowledge that evolves, and it actually consists of a lot of different subjects that you normally know from school. It all actually interconnect with the subject of wine. So when you're learning about wine, you also learn about the history. You learn about the history of wine. You need to know how that history affected the wine industry over the years. You learn about geography. The wine, of course, comes from a lot of different countries, so you need to know where they are. You learn about the languages. Because of those wines are based in different countries, you need to be able to pronounce them in those different languages. You need to learn about biology, about different grape varieties and how they grow. You need to learn about topography and altitudes, and all those things affect the wine as well. You need to learn about the business, how the markets change and how we sell specific wines in specific countries, and why those wines cost so much and the other ones that's not as much. So all of this is connected, and even a physical study is it's important. By just keeping fit. Being a sommelier or learning about wine means that we're probably going to be working in some sort of wine industry, in a hotel, a restaurant, which means we have to keep fit to be able to serve the wine, and it's a very, very busy industry. So it connects a lot of different subjects that we have to cover, and I know this can be quite intimidating and can be a little bit scary. But I want to take away that scare from you. I want you to feel that wine can be actually quite fun, and we can, by learning, slowly gain more confidence into how we explain the wines. So just a little bit myself, I actually started my journey in wine from just working in basic hotels, first as a dishwasher, then following through into becoming a bartender, and gaining more knowledge in cocktails and mixology, spirits, whiskeys, and then moving on into a wine because it's a much broader subject. It was always very interesting for me. So I was very lucky to work in a lot of different countries. I spent some time in Scotland, about 4 years, learning about the wine there and working for one of the most famous resorts in the world, called Gleneagles, which was owned by Diageo, one of the biggest distributors of wine in the world, and spirits as well. I spent some time in New Zealand, Australia. I worked also in Canada, working for Fairmont. And I spent 7 years working at the cruise line. So this is where I met Aurora. This is the place where I met a lot of people. Actually, in all those places, I met a lot of people who I actually learned a lot from, including from Aurora as well. So very grateful for all those places I've been in and worked. And now I'm actually based in Maldives, the beautiful islands here. I moved from being kind of front of house, working in hotels, to work for a supplier. So I'm in charge of the sales and marketing, as well as running a lot of different events and training of the staff. So I'm actually right now in one of the hotels here in one of the resorts, one of the islands. So I'm during right now the time when I'm actually running events for the guests here, as well as training the staff at the resort. And I'm telling you all of this not because it's not about bragging. It's actually to show you how versatile this career can be for you. I know maybe for you, this is just the beginning of your career. Some of you maybe already experienced working in a wine industry, restaurants or hotels. But this is a fantastic opportunity for all of you to travel the world and experience experience a lot of different things that interest you, as well as build your career. So I know there are a lot of different career paths you can take, but they not always give you this opportunity to travel the world and meet some interesting people around the world and learn from them. Even if you are a lawyer or a doctor, you have to study for 7-8 years, but really that skill that you learn there, it's only based in that specific country. So if you travel to a different part of the world, you have to do new licenses, and it's not very transferable. Whereas in hospitality, everything you learn right now or on your experience at work, you can actually transfer and go everywhere around the world and share that experience and actually that benefit from that experience. So those kind of trainings are very important. So I hope you come with a lot of passion for learning, and this is what we're gonna cover today, and I'm gonna help you with it. So first of all, I want to kind of talk about what we're gonna cover today. Of course, this is just the introduction to the wine world. This is a big subject. You can fill books about this subject. Actually, the intermediate course for that and CMS takes about 2 weeks. So it's impossible to cover everything in an hour-and-a-half session. But this purpose of this training is to give you a bit of a basic knowledge and to give you ability to gain confidence when you actually talk about wine. So over the years when I was studying wine, I discovered that there is a certain logic behind the wine. That when you actually take a bottle of wine, you don't need to know everything about that specific wine. Of course, those wines are changing. There's a lot of differences that happen throughout the years. Of course, the different vintages come out. It's impossible to learn everything about every single bottle of wine. However, if you know the basic knowledge and basic logic behind the wines, you can actually explain every single bottle of wine to a customer just by looking at the label, knowing the geography, knowing the climate when the wine is coming from. And this is what we're going to focus on. Within the hour, hopefully, you'll be able to discuss wine just by looking at the bottle and learning from the label what this wine is all about. So the topics we're going to cover are the factors affecting the wine styles, quality, and of course the price. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the understanding of the label of the wine. We're going to also talk about the major countries that produce wine and the major grape varieties that you see around the world. And at the end, we'll have a session with questions and answers. So moving on, the factors that affect the wine style, of course, the quality and price. There's a lot of different factors. Of course, we're talking about why is the wine in the different parts of the world tastes differently, as well as it's charged at different price. We talk about different qualities in the different countries and why the labels throughout those different wines will change. So the first factor that actually the first part that we're going to talk about is some of the facts. Those facts will help us kind of cover the next parts. So of course, wine, what is it? It's an alcoholic beverage. So it's made from fermented grapes. So by fermenting sugars in the grape juice, we can actually produce an alcoholic beverage. It's kind of similar to production of beer or maybe a cider. It's just that we're using grapes for that. Actually, in some countries, they allow to use different type of fruit even to produce wine. So they can make wine out of strawberries or raspberries. But for most part, the quality wine that is produced around the world is produced, of course, from fermented grapes. We have different types of grapes. We're going to talk about it a little bit more, a little bit further. Some of them are smaller, have seeds, some of them don't. And we have those sweeter type of table grapes as well. We're going to talk a little bit more the difference between them later. We, of course, have different grapevines, and I'll talk about the grapevines a little bit further. But of course, there is a time of a year when we can grow them. And generally, there is a difference between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. Generally, we pick the grapes in the Northern Hemisphere between the August and October. And in the Southern Hemisphere is complete opposite. We will pick them in February or April when the summer ends. We have with the wine specific vintage. Vintage basically means that the wine is of a specific year when we actually harvested the grapes. And there are also wines that are non-vintage, which means that they will collect the wines or the grapes from different years and make the wine and put them together. And that way we cannot declare a specific year when the wine is actually coming from. It will come from the blend of wines from different years of harvest. There are wines that are single variety, and there is also wines that are blended together. So different grape varieties are being put together and made it into a blend. I know a lot of people talks about, sometimes the single variety wines are better quality. Sometimes people say actually the wine blends are better quality. There's actually no rule behind it. It's a bit like listening to a music. If you hear an acoustic guitar, somebody playing absolutely beautiful, you want to just enjoy that acoustic guitar. You don't want any other noises kind of interfering with it. And that's what makes this type of music beautiful. However, by introducing maybe some other instruments, you adding more value to it, you add more complexity, and that way the whole sound with the whole orchestra, it's a little bit more complex and it's a little bit more valuable. However, if that orchestra doesn't work well together, you're just going to get a lot of noise and we're not going to get a beautiful sound or beautiful music. It's a bit the same with wine. So you can actually produce fantastic wines from a single variety alone, but also you can actually gain more from blending wines. However, it's about balancing and getting the best of each of the grape variety. The climate where we grow grapes, the best kind of climate, it's kind of set in a specific latitudes. Generally, we grow them in the North America. We can also grow them in the areas of Mexico and southern Canada. So it kind of spreads throughout the different parts of the world, but we need specific climate, and that's climate that's called temperate. Certain regions that we have are cooler, some of them are warmer, and they will produce different styles of wine. Some of them will be more tart, and some of them will be more ripe. So the first influencing factors that we have, of course, we have grape variety, environment, grape growing, winemaking, and maturation. So, of course, different wines will taste differently because they produce from different types of grape varieties. Of course, the environment where we grow the grapes will affect the actual style of wine. So if we grow it in a cooler climate or hotter climate, the different type of grape varieties can grow in those areas, as well as we can get different type of flavors from those grapes grown in those environments. The way we actually grow the grapes, if we're going to have them in a flat area, so we maybe put them on a mountain, on the slopes when they get more exposure to the sun, all of that will influence the end result and the end flavor of the wine. And of course, how we're going to produce the wine. So after we collect the grapes and we put them into maybe oak barrel, or we put it in a stainless steel vat, this will also affect the flavors and the end result and the end product. And of course, the maturation. So how long we keep the wine in those barrels or in a stainless steel tank. So all of this will have an influence on the end product of our wine. There are certain grapevines in the world. The most common wine, so the actual plant, the species of the plant, it's called Vitis vinifera. And this is the most common.
Vitis vinifera. Vitis vinifera.
Yep, I hear somebody just joined us. So we have this specific grapevine that is grown pretty much all around the world these days, where we produce wine. However, there's a couple other grapevines in the world that we can actually produce grapes from, but we don't necessarily make wine out of it. Actually, the species of the grapevines that we find around the world, there's about 80 of them. But actual grape varieties, if you can think of it, when you see Vitis vinifera here, we have 5,000 to 10,000 different grape varieties that will come from just that one species. So the other species of grapevines, so the actual plant, we have Vitis labrusca, which is the very common one that we found in North America. This one is quite important because it allowed the winemakers or wine producers to save their vines in Europe when they were actually affected by this pest called phylloxera, and that kind of spread it all over the Europe and actually came from North America. And this Vitis labrusca was resistant to it. So they actually took the roots of that species and they actually attached them to the roots of the or the cane of the Vitis vinifera style of species of the vines found in Europe. And that way they protected and saved the vines for us to enjoy the wines from the Vitis vinifera style of grapevines. The other ones that you find around the world are those two. These generally make grapes for production of jams, some maybe in quality wine, as well as grape juice. So you can actually find those species, very common. You might actually find in your country some of those other species, but they're generally not set for production of quality wine. So we're going to focus throughout this training really just on one species of vine, which is the Vitis vinifera, which can actually produce different types of grape varieties just from that one species of vine. So the grape itself, this is the kind of a look of a grape that you can see on the screen. Of course, it consists of the stalk, it consists of the outer side of the grape, which is our skin. We have inside the pulp when we get the juice, and of course we have seeds. There are grape varieties that don't have seeds at all, or they might have a little bit parts of it, and all of them will affect the actual flavor of the wine. Sometimes when we actually produce wine, we'll keep the stalks of the grapes with the grapes because we want to extract a little bit more additional tannins. But the most important part of understanding the grape is understanding that all the color in the wine will come from the skins of the grapes. So actually the inside of the grape is always colorless. There are only few varieties in the world that have colorful pulp, so the juice that comes out of the grape. However, we don't really produce any quality wine out of it. So we can basically say that any color in wine will always come from the skins, which means that it's possible by breaking the grape and just taking out the color, the juice, we can make white wines from red and dark varieties, right? So we have with grapes, sometimes they have different colors. Some of them are pink, some of them are very dark in color, some of them are white. So actually you can make white wines from even red varieties by just crushing the grapes and removing the skins and only collecting the juice, because the juice is always colorless. And a perfect example of these type of wine are the wines called Champagne. And they actually made from a grape variety called Pinot Noir, which is a dark variety. So all the color will come from the skin. So if we press on the skins, we're extracting the color. Why is this important? Because this actually tells us a little bit more about the wine as well. Of course, all the flavors in wine are hidden in the skins of the grapes. So the more we extract on the skins, the more flavor we get in our wine. And another part of something that is hidden in the skins of the grapes are tannin. And I know tannin, it's a kind of a difficult thing to explain. It's the kind of a drying coating effect that we have on the palate when we actually taste wine. The best way to explain tannins is to think about of a tea, right? So we're taking a tea bag, we're putting into a into a glass, we pour hot water over it, and within a minute or two, we have our perfectly brewed tea, right? It tastes nice, it's not too tannic, it's just perfect. But after 10 minutes or 20 minutes, that tea is starting to get more and more flavor, but also tannins being extracted. And when we're tasting a tea that's been brewed for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, it's just really bitter. It's kind of coating your palate, and that's the feel of tannins, the same feel that we get with certain wines. So what we can learn from it is that depending on the thickness of the skins, we can actually extract either more or less color into the wine. With that, we're also extracting more or less tannins. So a good way to understand wines is that if we have a red wine that has a very light red color, that means that we probably either only gently press on the skins of the grapes, or the skins are very thin, which means we also can expect that wine to be less on tannins. However, if the color of the wine is very deep and dark, we can expect we get more flavors in the wine, but also we can expect the wine will be a little bit more tannic. So this way, when you're actually looking at a bottle of wine or you pour the wine into a glass, without knowing anything about the wine, about the grape variety, you can already say, wow, the wine has a very deep dark color. It's probably going to be a little bit more heavy on the tannins. And of course, the juice will contain the water, all the sugars that we need for production of wine, and of course, the different acids, the sourness that the wine can give, and of course, that balances the flavors of the wine. The growing environment. To produce wine, we need a specific environment. We need, of course, carbon dioxide that will allow us to produce sugars within the wine. We need the sunlight, we need the water, we need the warmth, and we need specific nutrients. However, vines are a little bit more like pests. They can actually grow in the most difficult conditions, and they generally overtake, if they've been given all the environment that they need, they will actually overtake that environment. You will see places where people just grow vines for fun, and they will put them on the side of the walls. The vine will just spread all over the building, right? Because it will just continue to grow. It will continue to gain all the nutrients that it needs, and it will actually sometimes destroy other plants near it, just because it will just basically take over the area that it's in. So the vine are a bit like, I always like to compare it to us. If we have all the money in the world, we wouldn't go and study and progress and get better, right? We will just spend the money and have fun with it. It's when we are being put in these difficult situations, when we are experiencing a lot of stress and we really need to fight for everything in our life, it's when we become stronger, more powerful, and actually we produce more results. Think about it, right? When we know we have to study, when we have to gain knowledge and work very hard, we generally gain more results. The same happens with wine. If the vine is actually planted in an area that has, for example, Indonesia, when it has a perfect soils for growing because of its volcanic soil, it has all the nutrients it needs, it has the sun, it has plenty of water, it will actually overgrow, it will produce big grapes, and that means we're going to have a lot of water inside them, and the wine that we're going to get from those grapes is not going to be good quality. Generally, we get much better quality of wines in the very difficult areas to produce wine. So the idea of it is the soil type, it's maybe full of rocks, For normal types of plants, they wouldn't be able even to grow there. And that means the vine, to be able to get all the nutrients it needs to get very deep into the soil to collect all the nutrients. So the roots of that vine have to go very, very, very deep. If it has everything it needs, it won't even shoot out very long roots, which means it's going to be very fragile to different winds and different factors and hazards that affect the vineyard. So the more difficult the climate, the more stress we put on the vine, the less grapes we produce, but the more quality of the wine we will actually get from that wine. We have different types of climates where we can produce our wine, or we can produce, of course, or plant our vines. And climate is type of weather conditions. So within the climate, everything falls into things like temperature, amount of rainfall throughout the year, and amount of sunshine that we get in that specific year. So that's the difference between the climate and just the weather. So climate is something that's happening seasonally. So we can differentiate 3 different climates. We have the cool climate, moderate, and hot climate. So what happens to wine in those different types of climates? In a cool climate, and this is actually very important for you to remember, so if you're taking notes, maybe type that in, because that will help you to explain a lot of wines by just knowing from which climate it's coming from. So generally, in a cooler climate areas, we get wines that are less in alcohol, just because in those cooler climates, the shorter period of wine growing allows us only to gain very little amount of sugar within the grapes. With that, the body of the wine is generally a bit lighter, and we're also going to get a little bit less tannin. But in those kind of areas, when we have this cool climate, the wines generally are higher in acidity, that sourness when it comes. And the reason for it is the journey of the grapevine, or the grape on the grapevine, is that at the beginning, when we start, the vine starts shooting little buds of grapes, they're actually very bitter and very acidic. Later on, they start losing the acidity and they start collecting sugars. And that's the time when we have a perfect balance of amount of sugar and we didn't lose the acidity that we need, is when we collect the grape from the vine. So as you know, in a cooler climate, then naturally we're going to get more acidity, but less sugars in the wine, which means that also the wine will have less tannin and a lighter body. In the moderate climate, of course, this is going to be kind of in between. And in a hot climate, of course, it's complete opposite. So in a hot climate, the wines are generally going to be higher on alcohol. They're going to be heavier on tannins. They're going to be fuller on body, and they will have less acidity. Of course, we're going to get more sugars, so we're going to get more acidity. The wine is going to be less sour. So we grow the grapes in a specific latitudes and altitudes, and we of course need a specific bodies of water. So as you can see in a world map, there is a certain common things for growing grapes. We always grow them in between the latitude of 50 north and 30 north, as well as in the southern hemisphere will be between the 30 south and 50 south. This is the perfect areas for wine growing. Sometimes we can actually grow grapes a little bit above those latitudes in a specific conditions. As you can see in Argentina, there's area that it actually grows grapes just below that 30 degrees south, and it's because they can actually, so it's the area normally would be too hot to grow grapes. However, these are area of the very high up Andes, so where we are really high up in the mountains, that allows us actually to grow the grapes there, just because of the cooling effect that the mountains actually have on our grapevines. So the same thing happened in Canada. We can actually grow some grapes in Canada, and the reason for it is we have much longer days in the summer, which means the grapes have much more sunlight throughout the day, and we can actually produce some wines from it as well. They're going to taste completely different, even though the same grape varieties are found in different parts of the world, just because of a completely different climate and the altitude. And of course, the water factor is very important. Generally, the water factor is the cooling effect in these areas. So when we look at areas like Chile and South Africa, or even areas of Europe, a lot of the vineyards are planted planted very close to some sort of body of water. That body of water actually moderates the climate. So if you think of California, it's very close to the coast. If you think of Chile, if you think of Bordeaux, all of that climate is moderated by the influence of the sea. There are also grapes that are grown in a continental climate, which means they are landlocked. There's no big body of water like ocean or a sea. However, generally in those kind of locations, what they have, instead of a sea or an ocean, the vineyards will be influenced by a body of water like a river or a lake. So always we are some way surrounded by some sort of body of water that actually moderates the climate that we're in. The currents are very important. Again, we have the currents that are generally either warming the effect, the cooling effect that we get in a more continental climates like Europe. So they're actually helping warm up the area that we actually grow the grapes. And in the areas like California or South America or Australia, it's a little bit too hot to produce grapes. However, those strong currents actually, again, moderate our climate there. Here we have somebody. Okay, everybody's now muted. So we're moving into a weather. So weather is something that is specific to that specific location. And we have with that weather a certain hazards that can affect the actual flavors of the wine. So the first aspect is, of course, temperature. We have things like rain. We have things like wind, hail, and frost. So as I mentioned, that temperature is generally moderated by the bodies of water. We want a certain temperature throughout the year. In the higher the temperature, generally the more ripe fruit we will get, and with that more sugars. The wine's going to be bigger on body, higher on alcohol. They will have more tannins, and they will have less acidity. The cooler the temperature, again, we have complete opposite to that. The rain, it's something that is important. Of course, the amount of rainfall throughout the year, which means that either we will have to really protect the wines from too much rain. And that means that, for example, in October, if we know we're starting to get the grapes ripen perfectly, and we are worried that the rain might fall in a few days, we'll decide to actually pick the grapes earlier. The reason for it is when the rain starts falling down on the grapes will actually suck in all the water from the skins, which means that the wine itself or the grape juice that will later produce the wine will be quite diluted. So all of that will affect. Some areas are they're more like a desert. We don't get enough rain, so we actually have to irrigate the area ourselves to give enough water to the vine to produce our grapes. Wind is an aspect that is generally quite dangerous. It can be quite helpful, but in some areas, like in the southern part of France, they have those very strong winds called Mistrals, and those winds are generally almost they're very destroying to the vineyards. They are so strong they can actually rip out very young vines. So in that area, the vine itself learned that it has to grow very deep roots into the soil to protect itself from those very strong winds. Those winds can actually be beneficial to production of wine. For example, in the areas that we have frost. So frost is basically right now, actually, in the areas of France, they're struggling with the frost. So in the time when we start seeing the little grapes showing up on the grapevines, we have a sudden change of temperature. The temperatures are start dropping down below zeros, and the vines are starting to freeze. And this is the time, very crucial time, when the grape itself are very, very not only valuable, but very vulnerable. And they can actually, you can lose all your crop just because of frost and freezing all those vines as well as the grapes. So the wind can actually help us in the areas that there is a lot of wind and a lot of airflow. This kind of allows the air to not drop down, or the temperatures to not drop down below the zero and affect the area with frost. So generally, we don't see much of the frost in slopes when there's a natural flow of the air. And hail is a hazard. It's basically those big ice balls. I know in Indonesia, you guys probably don't get much hail. It's something very common in Europe. It's basically frozen ice that falls down from the sky. Sometimes it can reach the size of a tennis ball. And it can actually destroy cars. They can destroy roofs of the houses. And of course, if they can destroy those kind of tough equipment, it can easily destroy a very vulnerable vines. Soil will, of course, affect the flavors of the wine. We have different types of soils throughout different vineyards and locations around the world, and different grape varieties prefer different type of soils that they can grow on. So the aspect of the soils is that we might have a lot of different types of soils together. Sometimes we only have one specific type of soil. We might get, instead of a very combined soil together, we might have a very loose soil. We might have stones that will allow the roots of the vine to drain or go very, very deep. This will also affect the way the water is retained in that soil. So do we have a good drainage? That all this rain that's falling down, it's kind of moving away instead of allowing the vine to pick up too much water. Or sometimes in the areas that are kind of like deserts in the southern part of Spain, that soil will actually work like a sponge. In the time when we have a bit of rain, it will collect the water. And in the time when we have a lot of heat and a lot of sun, it will actually slowly give the water back to the vines when they need it. And of course, how much nutrients is in a specific type of soil that the grapes will need. Grape growing. So this also, of course, affects the production of the wine and how the wine is going to taste overall. As you can see, it's how we actually, the whole idea of grape growing is that all the activities that we do in the vineyard. So to start, in old times, the vines were planted in the rows right next to each other, which didn't allow the machinery to come in and collect the grapes, which means that the whole harvest of picking of the grapes has to be done by hand. That also means we need additional labor. It takes much longer time. However, we can be a little bit more selective during that process, and that's generally done for very expensive bottles of wine, when we actually hand select the grapes and pick the best grapes from the vines, and we are very, very nurturing during that process. However, this takes a lot of time and adds a lot of cost. So with areas of the world where these days we actually plant the vines with a little bit more space between them, we can have the machinery collecting the vines. We can do this whole process much faster. So if we know we're going to get affected by maybe some frost or a rain, which we don't want, sometimes we cannot collect the grapes right on time. With machinery, we can do this process very, very fast, and that also reduces the cost of overall wine. In the end of the day, we don't want to pay for all the bottle, the label. We want to pay what's inside the bottle, and we want to make sure that this is produced at the lowest cost as possible. Of course, this is not always possible with expensive bottles of wine when you're putting a lot of care to produce high quality wine. Of course, the amount of yields, so how much bunches of grapes we can actually get from a specific vine. So as I mentioned, vine is like a pest. If we give him everything he needs, it starts shooting as many buds and as many clusters of grapes as it possibly can. So as you can imagine, all the nutrients that will go from the vine, from the roots, from the soil, over the roots into the cane, and of course into the our bunches of the grapes, gets diluted over a certain amount of bunches of grapes that we're going to then later produce the wine from. So actually, in a lot of areas, we have something that's called pruning and cutting. The idea of it is that we actually cut part of the vine, generally the branches of the vine, to not allow it to spread too far, and to allow the vine to give all its nutrients to as little amount of bunches. So we get the more kind of concentrated quality within very small amount of bunches. So they will actually, in the beginning of the season, they will go in, and if they have maybe 10 or 20 bunches of grapes growing, they will cut a few away to all the power and all the energy of the vine go to the very small amount of bunches of grapes to get best results in the end product, and which is our wine. Of course, there's also activities, things like pest control and the disease control. As you can see on the picture here, we have the vineyard that is covered in nets. This is to protect it from birds. We have areas that are maybe have in the end of the vines that will actually plant some roses, because the roses get affected by different diseases much faster than the vines. So this can tell us if there is maybe some sort of disease in the vine much earlier, and we can then prevent it from happening to the vines itself. So all of that is all the activities that we see. And of course, the way we do the harvest, so as I mentioned, doing the machinery or is it hand-picked, in the areas, in a specific areas around the world, maybe we grow the grapes in the slopes, so the machinery cannot actually enter it. So that adds to the effort that we have to put in to actually collect those grapes. So how do we make the wine? There is a specific rule that we kind of obey to produce alcohol, and that's the idea of fermentation. The fermentation is kind of similar to a beer, to a cider, and any other alcoholic produce. So basically, to produce alcohol, we need sugars, which we find in grapes, right? So any sugars from different fruits, or if it's a malted barley, all of that we need to produce some sort of alcoholic beverage. For wine, it's the sugars that we find in the grapes. We need yeast, and yeast is a little microbe which actually eats the sugars. And as a result of its digestion system, it gives us alcohol. But with that, while it's producing the alcohol, right, it also produces a lot of heat and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide, it's something that actually allows us to make sparkling wines. So when you think about sparkling wines like champagne or cava or prosecco, this is done by just fermentation. Actually, if we can capture the carbon dioxide in the wine, we can produce those beautiful bubbles. And the heat is a kind of a byproduct of this conversion of sugars into alcohol done by the yeast. And it's something we need to control. So certain wines are actually temperature controlled during the fermentation process to not lose its flavor and the freshness. Generally, that's done with the white wines. When we actually ferment the white wines, we need to do it at a much lower temperature. That's why a lot of the white wines are actually fermented in the stainless steel tanks, when actually those stainless steel tanks at that point, they will work like a big fridges. And they will actually lower the temperature to not allow the wine to lose its flavor. However, for red wines, we want to extract more flavor, and that temperature will rise up to even 24, 28 degrees during that process. So how do we produce white wine? First of all, we crush our grapes. So basically, what we want to do is to actually crush the skins of the grapes to be able to extract the pulp, which is our juice. So by pressing pressing on those grapes after crushing, we are separating the skins, and we getting our juice that we need for production of our wine. So most of the white wines, we don't use any skins for later. We actually just getting the juice that we require. Then we ferment the wine. So we convert the sugars with the use of yeast, and we get our alcohol, heat, and the carbon dioxide. And we can do it either in the oak barrels, like big ones, that can hold maybe 500 liters. We can do it in the smaller barrels, like the ones that are like 250 or 500 liters. Sorry, those big ones. These can actually take about 5,000 liters. And then we can also have our stainless steel vats. These are the ones that allow us to temperature control it, so we don't get too much heat. And generally, white wines are done in those stainless steel vats for that reason. Then we have a maturation. So after the wine is fermented, it spends some time either in the big oak barrels, in a kind of smaller ones, or also we can mature the wines in a stainless steel vats. And I'm going to talk about the aspect and the end product, why actually those different types of maturation affect the wine a little bit later on. And then, of course, bottling, and then we have our white wine. For red wine, the process is a little bit different, and actually it's some way similar for rosé wine to be done in very similar ways. So rosé wine and red wine share the same process of making wine. So first of all, we get the grapes and we crush them. However, as you remember from the previous style for the white wines, we will actually remove the skins and we will only get the juice. For red wines, we want the skins because that's where the tannins and the flavor and the color is. So we actually generally ferment the wines with the skins. So as you can see, this is going to be our fermenters for the red wine, and generally the skins, just because they lighter, they will surface to the top of our wine, and in order to extract more flavor and more color, the people will actually either push on the skins to get them lower and to allow the juice to get as much of the concentration and extraction from the skins, or they will actually pump the wine over. So they will take the wine from the bottom of the tank and pump it over the skins of the grapes to again extract as much of the color, tannins, and flavor into the wine. Then we have something that's called pressing. Right? Again, we press on the skins of the grapes. In the old times, you probably heard of people used to actually get into those big vats and stamp on the grapes with their feet. This doesn't really happen anymore. Maybe for a very small boutique wineries, they just do it as a more of a gimmick. But these days, they actually use a specific machinery that allows them to press on the skins of the grapes. And that pressing can be different between the red wine and the rosé wine. So as you can see, for red wine, we actually press on the skins and remove the skins and just get the wine after the fermentation. There are actually wines that we keep the skins with the juice, and later on for fermentation. And for rosé wine, we don't press, and we only gently press on the skins of the grapes to just slightly release the color into the wine. So rosé wine, it's not like taking a white wine and red wine and putting it together, getting a lighter color. It's actually generally, your rosé wines are made from red varieties, the same as we use for the production of red wine. They are not any different. So you can make a rosé from a Merlot grape variety that produces red wine, but you can also make a rosé from it. You just take those grapes and you only gently press on the skins, or you don't press at all, and then actually a little bit of the color will be given to the wine, giving it this kind of a pink color. But with that, we don't get as much tannins. As you remember, if we don't press heavily on the skins, we don't going to extract the color. But with that, we also not going to extract as much of the tannins. And then we mature the wines. And again, either the big barrels, we can do it in the smaller ones, or we can do it in the stainless steel tanks. There's actually another method these days. We experiment with different types of maturation. We can actually do it in a concrete. This is becoming very popular these days. They actually take like a big barrel made of concrete. More looks like a egg, like a big egg, and we actually pour the wine into it, and we can mature the wines in those as well. But this is a kind of a new thing that we see a little bit more often these days. And then we have aspect of blending. So after the wine is maturing, so each variety is maturing separately, we have the art of blending. So we can then blend maybe the Merlot, the Cabernet, after it's all matured and it perfectly showcasing its own abilities. We blend the wines together into one end result of a product, which is then bottled, and then we have either our red or a rosé wine. And of course, we can take some time as well after the wine is bottled for aging that is happening in the bottle before it's actually sold. So maturation. There is two types of maturation. So the time when the wine is actually spending before it's released, we have the maturation that happens with oxygen and the maturation that happens without the oxygen. So with oxygen, we have, of course, our barrels. So the idea of it is the barrel actually slightly breathes, so it allows the wine to slowly oxidates with the oak, and increases the flavor profile of the wine. So the wine is not tasting only of the fruit flavors, but we start getting a little bit more oaky, woody flavor. We might get caramel, we might get spices into the wine, but that will be affected by the use of oxygen. Very cheap wines, instead of using very expensive barrels, they will actually have a big tank, and they will hang inside the tank pieces of oak barrel, or maybe some wood chips. And this is done for very cheap wines to just give them a little bit of flavor of the oak without actually investing in a very expensive type of barrel. Or we can actually mature the wines without oxygen in a stainless steel tanks, as you can see in the picture, or we can do it directly in a bottle. The idea of it is it's by preserving what the variety itself has to offer. So wines that are very aromatic, like the grape varieties like Riesling or Moscato, these are very aromatic grape varieties, or like Sauvignon Blanc. We don't want them to be affected by the oak and all these flavors that the oak gives. We want to preserve the freshness and fruitiness of that variety, and that's how we choose to put those varieties into stainless steel tanks. Factors that are affecting the cost of the wine. When you guys see the pictures that we have here on the screen, when you see all those barrels fall down, this is actually due to the earthquake that happened, and all the bottles falling down. We lose a lot of the wine in here. So do you think this will affect the cost of the wine if we lose all the crop? Well, definitely it will, and it happens very often. Sorry, go back. It happens very often in the areas that are prone to things like earthquakes. California, actually, probably you heard in the last few years, is struggling with droughts, so they don't get enough water, which they need. Even irrigation becomes very expensive. To add water into the plants becomes very expensive, and of course that affects the end product by they basically has to raise the prices because it's more expensive to produce wines in those areas. The vineyard itself can actually affect the price, and it generally affects the price the most. Think about a bit like when you buy a property. If you buy a property in the middle of Jakarta, right, the value of the land will be much more expensive than buying it in somewhere in the suburbs, right? The same thing happens in the area of Champagne, which is a very small area that produces one of the most high quality wines. This area is designated with a border. You cannot produce wines from outside of Champagne and call it Champagne. That means that any land within that area is very valuable. And that adds to the price of an end product of our wine. Of course, the labor, as you remember, as I mentioned, if you have to use people to collect the grapes, that will add to the cost of the wine. If you use machinery, you will reduce the cost of production of the wine. Then also what you use at the winery. So the equipment that we use. Sometimes small producers, it happens very often in the New World. So in the New Zealand and Australia, if you're a small producer, you cannot afford a bottling machine. You will actually rent the use of those machines from another producer. So big producers can have their own machinery and everything, and a bottling systems and all this equipment that they need, whereas the small wineries actually have to pay to use this equipment because they cannot afford it to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on equipment they will only use for maybe 2 or 3 days. So it's actually cheaper than to just rent it from a company. As you can see on this picture here, this also affects the cost of the wine. This is actually a very recent picture that happened in Chablis area in Burgundy of France. Right now, they're struggling with the frost. This is what I mentioned, when the temperatures at night are dropping very heavily. And this is what they actually do to protect the vines from these low temperatures. They will actually light up those bottles with oil and to try to heat up the ground and the area where the vines are in those big rows. So that also is very, very expensive to do, but this is only to protect the vines. In certain areas in the world, they would actually use helicopters that they will hover around the vineyards, moving the air. So all that flow of air would hopefully protect the vines from freezing and losing their grapes. And of course, packaging and distribution and sale, this affects the wines very heavily. So think about actually the place that I'm in right now. In Maldives, the duty on wine is very, very high. So we pay almost 200% on duty. So any wine that comes in from Europe, not only the shipping costs to get to Maldives is very high, but also we're adding the exchange rates, we're adding all the taxes and all the duty, and wines that are being purchased here in Maldives are much more expensive to what we find in Europe when we can buy products locally. So all of that affects the cost of the wine. Understanding the label. This is a very good skill to have. So go back. And the reason for it is that there is a certain way of learning the label of the wine and actually getting as much information from it. Sometimes on the wine competitions or wine courses, when you have exams, instead of giving you a bottle of wine to taste, or they will give you the whole bottle of the wine, they will tell you they will give you only the label of the wine, and they will ask you to put as much information and describe the wine just by looking at the label. And the label actually gives us a lot of information. All this text that is on it can give us quite a bit of information, or can give us very little information. As you can see, those two different labels that we have on the screen are completely different.
Geographic indication.
We have, hold on, we have somebody unmuted. We have two different types of labels here. As you can see, they're completely different. The one on the right pretty much tells us the name of the wine. It doesn't really give us even a producer name. We don't know if it's a producer or if it's just the name of the wine. It only tells us the country the wine is coming from. It tells us the size, and really just tells us the alcohol level, and you know the wine is produced in France. So we don't really get too much information from it. Actually, there is only one item that has to be on the label of the bottle of wine. It doesn't matter when the wine is produced. So anywhere in the world, if you find a bottle of wine, even if it's not produced in this country, but it's sold in this country, there is one common thing that has to be on the label of the wine, and that's alcohol percentage. That's the only one common thing that all the countries will share. Some countries have a very strict laws on what has to be on a label, by saying who is the producer, where is wines produced in. But actually, very simple labels can be created, just telling you the percentage of alcohol, the country, not even the region, and what the grape varieties are. However, most of the quality wine, they will give you a lot of information, and that tells us a lot about the wine itself. So as you can see in here, we know in here that the wine is produced by a producer called Albert Mann. The wine comes from France. It comes from a specific region, comes from the area of Alsace. We know that this area is not only just a specific region within France, but also it's a region that has the status of Grand Cru, which means it's the higher quality style or the higher quality region designated for production of high quality wines. We know it's part of the appellation here, that they actually control by law the production of that specific wine. We know the grape variety is the Gewürztraminer, right, or Gewürz, how the people like to call it. We know the name of the vineyard itself. We have the vintage of the wine. We have the alcohol. So we have a lot of different information about this wine itself. And this is very helpful, because by knowing of the grape variety, I already know the flavor profile. If I know what the grape variety is, I know what the flavor profile of the wine I can expect from it, and I know how this grape variety evolves over time. So if I know the vintage of the wine, I know that this Gewürztraminer is not going to taste of fresh fruit and flowers, and it's not going to be very young. This is already a very aged, mature style Gewürz, so I'm expecting to taste more honey, dried fruit, mango, and peach. I didn't even taste the wine, but I'm already able to explain the wine by just looking at the label. So this is a very valuable skill. There is another good thing to know, and this has to do with the sweetness of the wine, but we're actually going to talk about it in the next slide. So as you can see, we have those two different styles or the indications on the grapes. We have the wines with, indications on the wines. We have the ones that have the kind of geographical indications, and then we have the ones that don't have that geographical indications. So for the once they have geographic indications, we can determine a specific protected designation of origin in a certain wines. So in France, that protected designation of origin is called AOC. Yeah, so or Appellation d'origine contrôlée. So you see this on the label of the wine. This is like the highest level when they actually created laws. So wines like Chablis will be the AOC styles of wine. And that means that it can only come from that specific designated area. And it has to be produced from a specific grape. We have to produce it in a specific way. We have to control our yield. All of that is actually designated by the law. And each country has their own terms of the appellations. In Italy, they are called DOC or DOCG. DOCG is a kind of a little bit higher level. In Spain, we have DO or DOC. And then in Germany, we have something that's called Prädikatswein and Qualitätswein. And then also within a country of France, we have something that's called, these are protected geographical indications. However, they don't have a strict rules like the AOC. So we can actually play around a little bit more with different types of grape varieties. So the wine can be from Burgundy, but we can maybe use grapes of Alicote, or maybe instead of Chardonnay, we can maybe use some Pinot Blanc. The wine would still be called Burgundy, but it will have a status of Vin de Pays instead of the status of AOC, because now we have a little bit more flexibility of using maybe different grape varieties there. And Italy, those type of wines are IGT style wines. In Spain, these are the Vino della Terra. And in Germany, these are called Landwein. And we have a general labeling or terms that we see. Again, as I mentioned, we have a producer and brand. This is a very common thing. So you know who is the producer and you know generally what's the brand of the wine. Sometimes certain producers have a lot of different brands. Sometimes it can happen like this Gevrey-Chambertin. It's actually an area where we produce the grapes. However, the wine is made by a domain Louis Jadot. This domain is a winery that purchased grapes from farmers within Burgundy area. And they purchased those grapes from the area of Gevrey-Chambertin. So we already know that this is from a domain called Louis Jadot. We know from area where it's produced. If we know the area, we also know the grape variety, because in this area, we can only produce wines from a grape called Pinot Noir. So just from the label, I'm getting a lot of information there. In here, as you can see, this is produced by the producer here. However, the wine is called Le Mans. We have the grape variety, we have the vintage, and we also have description on how sweet the wine will be. So sometimes the wine would say for a sparkling wine like a Brut. For other wines, they might say dry. And here it says demi-sec, so it's a wine that is going to be slightly sweeter on the side. And then we know the wine comes from France, we know the alcohol level, and we know the size of the bottle. And with this one, we have a little bit less information. We know the area, we know the grape, we know the wine is a Reserva, so it means maybe it comes from a kind of a better area or better estate of that specific vineyard. Another kind of typical things we might notice with the labels, sometimes, especially in the New World, there is a lot of indicators on the label that can really give you a lot of information about the wine. For example, in here, you see the Clos du Bois produces the Chardonnay from the North Coast. This is a 2011, and they give you a little hint that the wine is unoaked. So it's been fermented and matured in the stainless steel tanks. So they don't have any influence on the oak. So I already know that if this wine comes from California, it's a warmer climate, the wine probably going to be higher on alcohol, going to have less acidity, going to have fuller body, will have more flavor. And I know it's not going to be, those flavors not going to be oaky, it's going to be more on that tropical fruit, because that's the typical flavors of our Chardonnay. So I already can explain a lot of those things about the wine without actually tasting the wine or reading anything about this wine. Again, here we have things like the old vine. So this tells you that the vines themselves are older, so they naturally produce less grapes. The grapes are much more concentrated, so the wine is going to be of the higher quality. We have much more concentrated styles of wine. And here we have the information that the wine comes from the organic grapes. This is very trendy these days, where producers actually tells us that the winery is either biodynamic or organic. It's a kind of becoming more and more important factor on the wine. And then we also have something that's called botrytis. This will tell us that the wine's been affected by a specific rot, which is actually very valuable to the grapes. It makes them shrivel into tiny little raisins, and that means the water vapors out of the grape, and we're getting very sugary, syrupy grape juice, which we can then ferment into a very luscious, sweet dessert wines. So I already know that this is a dessert wine because it uses the grapes that are being affected by botrytis. And another aspect of understanding the label is sometimes when you pick a glass or pick up a bottle of Riesling, it's a variety that can be done in both very dry style or very sweet style. How do you know which style we're getting? And how do you know, is the wine going to be sweet or is it going to be dry? And the easiest way to look at it is to look at the alcohol percentage. So as you know, the alcohol in wine comes from sugar. So if we convert all the sugar in the grape juice into alcohol, we're going to have a higher alcohol level, maybe around 13, 14, 15%, but we're going to have a very little sugar left, which means the wine is going to be dry. If we have alcohol level like in here, 10.5, we already know they probably left some sugar inside the wine. The alcohol level that way is quite low, and the wine is going to be on the sweeter side. So this is a kind of a good indicator to understand which wine, just by looking at the label of the wine, which wines are sweet and which wine is dry. So major wine producing countries. As you can see here, we have over 90 countries that actually make wine in the world, but 12 of them, the major players in the world, produce about 80% of the whole wine production. So if you get to know quite well most of those 12, you pretty much covered. That makes the thing simple. You don't have to learn every country. You can learn major producers out of those 12, and this will help you to understand specific flavors we can achieve with those wines, what type of grape varieties we grow in them, what type of topography and the climate we have in those countries. And generally, knowing those basic countries, you have a better understanding of the others. Because if we have a climate that is very similar to Spain or France, you already know that probably they're going to be sharing the same type of grape varieties. The wine's going to take the same style. So the wines of Riesling in Germany and the Riesling in Canada, it comes from a cooler climate. We have the same grape variety. They should share the same style. So understanding those major countries is really what you need to know, and then you can progress from there. So the first country we're going to talk about, this is, of course, France. France is generally described as the most diverse in styles of wines, in the grape varieties. And it's one of the most important because a lot of other countries base their knowledge and create their styles of wine based on each of those regions that we found that are completely different that we find in France. So knowing each of those regions that we see here and what grape varieties we grow and why we grow them and what kind of wines we get from there can help you compare it to the other area in the world. If there are similarities there, you know if the wine of this specific, in Loire, we have a wine called Sancerre. We know that it's made from a Sauvignon Blanc grape variety. So if we know the wine in Marlborough is also have a very similar climate, we have also the same grape variety of Sauvignon Blanc, the wines are very similar in style. So we see a lot of similarities in different parts of the world. So as long as we know these areas, we can already describe other wines from around the world. So the first region, as you can see in the northern part of France, is the region of Champagne. So looking at this, we are very high up in the northern hemisphere. We probably expecting this area to have a climate called cool climate. This is going to be more continental because we are not very close to the Atlantic Ocean or to the North Sea. So we are kind of landlocked. We have a very cold winters and moderate summers. In here, we will only grow grape varieties that are generally regarded as cool climate grape varieties like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and that's how we make the sparkling wines in this area. To the right, we have the area called Alsace, which again is a cooler climate area, continental, and we see grape varieties like Riesling, Gewürztraminer, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris. All of those varieties, mostly white wines, are being produced here. Again, cooler climate, we're expecting the wines to be high on acidity, less on alcohol, less on tannin, and less on the body. Loire, we're starting to get to a little bit more moderate climate, cool. Again, we see a lot of white varieties here, a little bit more red. The big king of this variety is our Sauvignon Blanc, which produces very grassy style, cooler climate, very acidic style of Sauvignon Blanc grape. And they are generally hidden under the name of Sancerre. We have our Burgundy, one of the most expensive wines and heavily collected by connoisseurs. In this region, we see, this is again continental climate. We see varieties like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and we have a lot of different styles of this grape variety being grown here in the area of Burgundy. We have Beaujolais, which produces mostly red wines called Beaujolais, made from grape variety called Gamay. And then we have area of Côte d'Or. This is the yellow area here, which produces grapes like Syrah and some white varieties in the north. And then in the south, we start getting more red varieties just because of the influence of the Mediterranean, the warmer climate. We start producing wines from a lot of different types of red varieties. We have the Provence, which is the main area for rosé. We have Languedoc, which also produces some beautiful rosé as well as the red wines. And then we have the famous Bordeaux, which very heavy, big Cabernets and Merlots come from, very well regarded and one of the most expensive wines that we find in France. So as you can see here, now we see them a little bit more easier. We have them divided by the climates. So in a cool climate, we see the northern part of France. So we have wines of Champagne. We have a Loire Valley with the Sauvignon Blanc. We have Burgundy with Chardonnay. We have Loire Valley again with a Chenin Blanc. This is the common variety there. We have the Alsace with the Riesling. And again, Burgundy with Pinot Noir for a red variety. The warm and continental climate will be your Bordeaux, Beaujolais, and the northern part of Syrah. And then we have our warm climate in France, which is going to be your Provence rosés. We're going to have our blends in the Rhone Valley, and we're going to have our Malbec that is also found in there. What is also interesting about France is that because of the importance of specific areas within France, we have a much harder labeling of wines to understand. And the reason for it is a lot of the wines are actually blended together from different grape varieties. So for example, Bordeaux, typical Bordeaux will have a blend of Cabernet, Merlot, a lot of different grape varieties that will go into this wine. And the reason for it is they actually perfected for over the years the production of wine in this region, meaning that we can actually, every single season, doesn't matter how the vintages or the years and the type of weather we're going to get that specific year, we can actually equalize the wine by using a little bit more Merlot this year or a little bit more Cabernet. And every year they can produce a fantastic quality of wine. But however, for us as a customer, we don't really know what goes into that bottle because they only call the wines by the name of the area where it's coming from and then the name of chateau. This is more important in that area than the actual grape variety itself. Whereas in the area of California, we see already what the grape variety is and generally how much of that grape variety goes into that bottle of wine. And we see more single varieties being produced. We're going to move on to Italy. Italy is a very diverse country. It has over 3,000 different grape varieties grown only in this country. So you can study and study this country for a long time and you will still continue to study. But there are certain similarities within the regions and a little bit more logic behind them. So as you can see, the country kind of, people say it reminds them, in the shape reminds them of a leg. with a shoe, right? So, and it's Italians love soccer or football, depends how you want to call it. So our Sicily or our Sardinia is the ball that they're kicking, right? So this is the boot of Italy. We have the heel of the boot where we have the area of Puglia, and we have the top of the boot, which we have the areas of Piemonte, we have Veneto. So this is going to be, this part here is going to be our cooler climate. So any wine that will come from this area, again, cool climate. We know the cool climate produces wines that are less on alcohol, less on body, that are generally less on tannins, but they generally have high acidity. So just knowing from where those wines are coming from in this area, we generally expect those kind of profile of the wine. We know in here we're getting into more Mediterranean climate, big influences coming from Africa, from Sahara. Very hot winds are coming into Sicily and Calabria and Puglia, and we have a very hot climates here and producing very heavy reds, wines that are high on alcohol, high on flavor, high on sugar, and again, very and less on acidity. And right in between, areas of Toscana, Marche, we have wines that are generally kind of in a moderate climate, and again, those wines going to be in between the styles of cool and hot climate. As you can see, this is explained again, the cool climate, Northern Italy, Prosecco, Moscato d'Asti, Pinot Grigio. These are the typical styles of wines that we find in that cool climate. So Valpolicella, Barolo, Barbera. In a slightly warmer climate, we find areas of Chianti in Tuscany, so Sangiovese. We have the super Toscan wines. We have Montepulciano. We have those sweet wines of Vinsanto. We have Lambrusco, and we have Vermentino, and this is the central part of Italy. And then we have our hot climate. So we see varieties like Primitivo, Negro Amaro. As you can see, certain grape varieties only like a specific climate. You're not seeing Nero di Avola in a cool climate. Also, you're not going to see a Pinot Grigio in a very hot climate. They're just not performing well in those areas, and that's why we don't grow them. So for every climate, we have different range of grape varieties. Spain, a big country, is actually the largest planted area by vines and by area that we have in Spain. So it's right behind in production behind in France. So actually the biggest producer of wine in the world generally changes over time, but the most common one, commonly winning this award for the biggest production of wine is actually Italy. And then we have the second and third place is generally between Spain and France. The fourth one will be actually United States. And fifth one is a quite interesting one because you probably wouldn't expect it, and that's China. Just because China has a lot of area to produce wine, and they're starting to actually getting better and better at it, and they also had a big demand on wine. It's 1.6 billion people living there, so there's a lot of demand on production of wine, so they started to make their own. So Spain is the third largest global producer, sometimes is in the second place, sometimes in the third. It produces wines generally in already a warmer or hot climate. The grape varieties will be typical to Spain. We have Cava, which is the typical sparkling wine of Spain, which is generally done kind of very close to the border of France. So in the area here, we will see our Cavas. We have area of Rioja, which actually produces both white and red wines, and that's generally done in here, so the northern part of Spain. So we're getting more kind of moderate and to warm style of climate. And then we have this big, large area called La Mancha, which produces a lot of low-value wines, just because it's a flat area. So it's easy to put machinery in. We can actually produce some very good quality wines. However, they're generally lower on price. So there's great values that we find in this area. And then right on the west part of Spain, very close to the border with Portugal, we have wines that are called Albarino, which is the same grape variety used for wines found in Portugal called Vinho Verde. So if you ever heard of those great wines, they will come from this area of Spain or this area here of Portugal. And then for the red varieties, we have varieties called Tempranillo, which is the king of all Spanish varieties. It's a variety that can age and really enjoys being put in oak barrels. So it performs very well in being aged for a very long time in oak barrels, getting a little bit more complexity over time. And another variety there found is Garnacha, some Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah. Also, what's interesting about the country of Spain is probably one of the largest producer of rosé wines. So a variety like Garnacha, which is also found in France under the name of Grenache, produces fantastic rosé wines. So Spain is very well known for rosé production. Germany is a tough one. And the reason for it is mostly because it's language. The language is very difficult. The words are sometimes so long, they are very hard to pronounce. And even though the wines can be, we're using generally a single variety wine, so it seems to be, on that aspect, it should be quite simple. And we don't really have that many grape varieties because we are in a much cooler climate. We only produce wines in a cooler climate here. We don't have a hot or warm climate. So it should be quite simple, but the name and terminology in Germany is quite complicated. So I'll try to kind of explain a logic behind the level of sweetness just in a moment. But the main grape varieties found are generally white varieties. As you can see, 70% of production of German wines are white varieties, and they're generally done from either Riesling or a variety called Müller-Thurgau. We also find another variety called Silvaner, but you don't notice it as more often. So the main varieties are those two. And then for the red variety, they have something called Spätburgunder, which is a dark Burgunder, so a variety found in Burgundy. So a dark variety found in Burgundy is our Pinot Noir. For in Germany, we can also find Chardonnay, and they will actually call it Weißburgunder. And then they also have a variety called Pinot Gris, which they called a Grausburgunder, so gray Burgundy wine. So a variety that we generally find in that area. What is interesting about Germany is that generally we produce wines in the whole spectrum. So the Rieslings can be very dry. They can also be very sweet. And how do we know and how do we differentiate those wines? They actually created this pyramid that tells you not necessarily about the sweetness of it wine, but actually the sweetness of the grape juice before it's fermented. And what's the difference? Is, well, it is a bit of a difference of how sweet the grape juice is compared to how sweet the actual wine is because, as you know, we can convert during fermentation all that sugar in wine into sweetness in the wine, all the dryness in the wine, and into alcohol. So wines of cabinet is generally the wines that are that have the least amount of sugar at the level of the grape juice. So when we convert them, we naturally don't have enough of sugar to produce very high on alcohol wines, and generally all the cabinet style wines are dry. It's getting complicated when it gets to the wines that are called Spätlese, which means a late harvest. So we waited a little bit longer for the grapes to sit on the vine, and we start getting grape juice that has a little bit more sugar content, which now we can decide either we convert all that sugar into alcohol, and Spätlese wines would generally have either a little bit higher alcohol level than cabinet, and they will be dry, or we don't convert that sugar, and they will have the same alcohol level as cabinet, but they will taste sweeter than cabinet. And this is why it gets a little bit complicated. So Spätlese wines, which means that wines are produced from a sugar grape juice that has a little bit higher content of sugar. Auslese wines are almost always sweeter, just because now we have a very late harvest. We get already that much sugar that it's impossible to make a dry wine. So naturally, those wines are much sweeter. Then we have wines that are called Bieren Auslese, which means the wines are now from almost shriveled to the grapes. They are very, very late harvest. We have wines that are called ice wines. So they actually allow the grapes to freeze. And they collect the grapes when they're frozen. They extract the frozen water out of the grape, and they produce very luscious sweet wines. And the last one is very tricky just because the name is not very clear. Cabernet wines are often called trocken in Germany. Trocken actually means dry. So if you ever see on a bottle or the label of the German wine a term called trocken, this means dry. And a lot of Cabernet wines will have this terminology, which means trocken means dry. However, here, this is one word. This is trocken bieren Auslese. So that one word means that the wine is not dry. It's the little berries, which is our grapes, are from the late harvest, very late harvest, Auslese, and they are almost dried out. So the trocken, which means dried out, very late harvest berries. And these are the most sweet wine, the most luscious wines, and these are also the most expensive wines we find in Germany. South Africa, as you can see, pretty much whole South Africa goes into a tiny little region compared to the actual size of the country, and everything revolves in the area close to the coast, just because the continental climate just doesn't allow to produce quality wines. It's just too hot here, so we have the influence of the ocean moderating the climate for us very close to the coast. We have a lot of different areas from the Western Cape to the coastal regions. It's kind of a maritime climate there. And the first vines are actually planted in 1655. So this is the oldest, what we call the New World region found in the world. So Old World regions are areas like Germany, France, Italy, Spain. But when we talk about the New World, it's the areas that were planted a little bit later on, and generally they cultivate the wines based on the knowledge we found in the Old World. So this is the first area we really find the grapes in 1655. They were brought over generally by the Dutch coming over. This was a big stop for the Dutch going over to India to trade, and of course it was easier to produce their own vines here and produce their own wine and sell it over. So this is why we have the vines here. This was really produced because of the influence of the Dutch. The main grape varieties are your Chenin Blanc, or how they call it in South Africa, this grape variety called Steen. We have also varieties like Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc. We have something called Pinotage, which is a crossing between Pinot Noir and Cinsault. We have Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, Merlot, and Pinot Noir. Then we have Australia. We have our western part of Australia, which produces mostly wines of Chardonnay. Australia is much hotter climate. As you can see, we grow grapes pretty much under this line. This is way too hot to produce grapes. So everything is produced in this kind of southern part of Australia. Tasmania produces cooler climate. So the lower we go, the lower the area of Australia is, the cooler the climate. We will have more kind of moderate to warm climate in here. And in here, we have much hotter climate that is influenced by the continental or the maritime influence here. And then the grape varieties: the Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, Riesling, Shiraz, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Grenache, and Pinot Noir. As I mentioned, these are the cool climate: Victoria, Tasmania. Western Australia would be a warm climate. South Australia, New South Wales. And then we go into our New Zealand. Again, this is even below Australia. The only regions that are kind of in the same latitude as Australia is our northern part of New Zealand. So we produce some heavy big reds in here. And then this area of Hawke's Bay is very similar to the area of Bordeaux. So we're seeing a lot of similarities here. So if you know well your Bordeaux wines, you will know the Hawke's Bay wines will taste very similar, and we have the same grape varieties being grown there. Then the area here of Marlborough, the most famous area of New Zealand wines, is very similar to Loire Valley. So we're seeing a lot of grape varieties like Sauvignon Blanc being grown in that area. And then when we have area of Central Otago, this is more closer to an area of France called Burgundy. So we see a lot of grape varieties and styles of wines very similar to Burgundy wines. What's interesting about New Zealand wines, they are the ones who invented screw caps. So, and they very, maybe not invented, but really brought over as their way of packaging their wines. So these days they actually most of their wines are under screw caps, which is a great thing. It actually preserves the wine for better than a cork. It actually allows their wine to age very well under the cork, and it's also cheaper. So a great way. It's only our perception why we generally see wines being under the cork, regular cork being regarded as better quality. Actually, you can produce fantastic quality wines and put them under screw caps. And you see more and more producers, even in France, as turning into and changing the regular cork into screw cap because of its benefits. US, as you can see, we don't really grow any grapes for production of quality wine in the center of United States. Everything is grown either on the West Coast or on the East Coast, when we have the influence of the maritime climate. Most of it comes from California. This is the biggest production there. And within California, we have, again, a big influence of the maritime climate. And the main grape varieties will be your Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc. As I mentioned before, we had the phylloxera that kind of affected the grapes of France. So when they replanted the vines, they actually used the typically found Vitis labrusca rootstock, which they planted underneath, or they connected the Vitis vinifera together with the rootstock of labrusca, and that way they preserved and protected the vines of Vitis vinifera. And for the red varieties, we have the Cabernet Sauvignon, Zinfandel, Merlot, Pinot Noir, and Syrah. Argentina, what's interesting about Argentina is it's a very long country. And if you remember from the latitudes, we said that there are certain areas of Argentina go below the 30 degrees south latitude. And the reason why we can still grow grapes there, even though it should be quite hot, we are much closer to the equator, is because we have this big mountain range here coming through. And this mountain range is called the Andes. And these Andes, generally the vineyards are planted very high up, above at least 1,000 meters above the sea level, which means that we get a lot of influence from the slopes, and as well as the cooling effect from the mountains, actually reducing the temperatures and allowing those areas to produce fantastic wines. So we don't really have as much influence of the body of the water, like the ocean or a sea or a river or a lake. We have the influence of being very high up in the mountains. And we see varieties like Malbec, which is the main variety found in Argentina, Cabernet Sauvignon, Bonarda, and Syrah. And for the white varieties is Torrontés, which is a kind of a native variety found in Argentina. Chile, it's on the other side. So if you compare, this will be Chile here. So it borders with Argentina. As you can see, it's much more narrow country. It goes along the border with Argentina, but it also borders with the ocean here. So we have much less areas of production of wine, but we have much longer area to produce wine. So a lot of the areas where we produce wines will be either have a coastal influence, or we are very close to the Andes. So we have different styles of wines, either maritime or continental climate high up in the mountains. And your main varieties will be your Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, and for pretty much most of the production of Chilean wines are plantings of Cabernet and Merlot, and a variety that is called Carmenere, which is again something kind of a native these days to the area of Chile. For a very long time, it was mistaken as a Merlot. After they actually checked the DNA of this grape variety, they discovered it was not a Merlot, but actually this ancient variety almost lost in France called Carmenere. So major grape varieties. So understanding the flavor profile of a specific grapes and understanding from where they actually coming from, we can explain the wines without actually knowing anything about that specific bottle. So probably the most common grape variety found in the world is our Chardonnay. What's interesting about the Chardonnay is you hear it quite often with people saying they either hate it or they love it. An interesting thing about it is that it's actually the easiest grape variety to grow. As I mentioned, some grape varieties prefer cooler climates, some of them would prefer a hot climate. Chardonnay, you can grow anywhere you can grow grapes, you can grow Chardonnay. But depending on where the Chardonnay is grown, we get completely different styles of it. So it's very hard to say you hate the Chardonnay because there's so many different styles of it. And I've seen it before when customers or our clients would say that they hate Chardonnay, but the next thing they do, they will order a Chablis and they say this is their favorite wine, even though it's produced from 100% Chardonnay grape. It's just it comes from a cooler climate and it's not something that they were used to. They were generally drinking Chardonnay of hot climate and they just didn't like that style. So it's a very, very diverse grape varieties. As you can see, in a cooler climate, it generally has higher acidity, which is typical to that climate. It has more green fruit, citrus, and vegetable notes. Whereas when we get to the hot climate, the flavor profile of the same grape variety changes to be more tropical. We get more pineapple, peach, mango, and fig notes. And of course, this can be affected by the use of either stainless steel tanks when we preserve all this freshness and fruitiness, or we can maybe use some oak aging when we additionally add the flavors of toast, vanilla, and nuts. So all of that can be done with the process of making the wine. Sauvignon Blanc, it's the variety found normally either in the area of France in Loire Valley, but we can also find it in New Zealand in the area of Marlborough. So as you can see, in Loire Valley, we generally get the flavor of lime because it's much cooler climate. In Marlborough, New Zealand, it's a slightly warmer climate. So the same variety evolves to taste a little bit more like a passion fruit, has this very dominant gooseberry, and it's generally a variety that is very high on acidity. So it's a little bit more sour, but it's very aromatic. And we generally don't see this variety being put in oak barrels. It's because it's a very, very, very aromatic variety. Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio, it's the same name. I know in certain countries they will call it different term. This is generally the term used in Italy, and this is generally the term used in France in the region of Alsace. So what's interesting is that other countries like Australia or California, when they grow this grape, they will try to guide you with the style of the wine that it's produced based on the name of the wine. So if they produce in California the wine in a style of the Pinot Gris that we normally find in Alsace, and the profile of flavors is very similar, they'll call this wine a Pinot Gris. However, in the same region in California, if they're making the wine to be tasting like the Pinot Grigio we find in Italy, they will use the term Pinot Grigio. So they can actually call it either Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio. However, in the term Pinot Grigio, it's generally found in Italy, and Pinot Gris in France in Alsace, but we also find it in the different parts of the world. And the typical flavors of it will be flavors of melon, nectarine, or you're getting sometimes some peach and kind of like a ripe apple flavors. Riesling is a grape variety that generally prefers cooler climate, is associated with regions like Germany, but we also find it in the cooler climates of Australia. We might find it in the parts of France and also in Alsace. Sometimes we find it in US or in Canada as well. And it produces wines, as I mentioned, that are going from all the way from dry, so trocken, right, all the way to sweet. The Bieren Auslese will be the sweetest wines. And what's interesting about the Riesling is that it has a very unique flavor that any other grape variety has. Of course, the flavors in wine, as you know, these are not something that is added to the wine. It's only there are specific enzymes in the wine that only remind us of the flavors that we already know. So they are not flavors of green or green apple. These are only flavors of Riesling that reminds you of the flavor of a green apple because they taste or smell similar. So Riesling has this very unique aroma of petroleum that actually can achieve this aroma. Some people like it, some people don't, but it's kind of a very designated aroma that we find it only really in Riesling. Gewürztraminer was a variety feared by many for a long time just because it was very hard to pronounce it. These days, it's one of the most attractive varieties because it's very aromatic. It often produces sweeter wines, and people just these days, instead of calling it by the full name, they just call it Gewürz. Viognier, a typical variety we find in the Rhone Valley. A typical flavor profile of this variety is peach. We find it, as I mentioned, in France and Rhone Valley. We also find it in Australia. some parts of US as well. It used to be a very typical variety found in US, not as much these days. And it produces very floral, low on acidity wines with kind of a little bit more higher alcohol content. Chenin Blanc, a variety found in South Africa, very common these days. It used to be known very well in France, in an area of Vouvray. Generally prefers slightly a cooler climate, so it produces more citrus style wines with that green apple. In a warmer climate, it can produce actually much higher alcohol and lower acidity. It can be generally done in a dry and off-dry style. And a flavor profile is generally, as I mentioned, lemon, that kind of pear and honey. Semillon is a variety found generally in the Bordeaux or Hunter Valley in Australia. It's generally associated, it can produce dry wines, but it's generally associated to produce those very, very sweet wines called Sauterne. And it's because this variety can easily get affected by this noble rot, which I mentioned before, the botrytis, and allows this to produce those very beautiful, sweet, delicious wines, which are very, very pricey. Torontes is a grape variety found in Argentina. We mentioned it before. It's somewhat native to Argentina. And it produces very interesting wines. If we say there is a fashion in wine that years before people were drinking only Chardonnay and only Sauvignon Blanc because they didn't know any other grape varieties, these days we are trying to try new things that are a little bit more exciting, things like Fiano, Greco di Tufo. These varieties becoming very popular. Torontes is one of the most popular, very fashionable wine these days. It's because it produces wines that are in between a Riesling and Sauvignon Blanc, varieties that are very aromatic, but actually on the palate, they are very dry. They have this kind of medium to even high acidity. So very crisp and refreshing without being overly sweet. Albarino, again, very popular variety these days, produces a lot of wines that taste of like peach or nectarine, and we generally find them in the area of Spain. Prosecco. Prosecco is actually, these days we call this a grape variety, but the actual term for this grape variety is called Glera. And as you probably heard, Prosecco are the famous sparkling wines of Italy. And even though they're less expensive as champagne, they can be produced the same way as champagne is done. So in a method called the bottle method, when this whole fermentation process, when we're trying to capture the carbon dioxide in the wine that produces the bubbles, we can do it in the bottle. However, cheaper Proseccos can also be produced in a much bigger tanks. They're generally not as sparkling as the better quality ones. So we find both inexpensive and more expensive styles of Prosecco, but they generally share this one common thing. They're a little bit more approachable just because they not taste of that yeast. They don't have as much of toastiness. They're a little bit more refreshing and a little bit more fruity. So that's why a lot of people who maybe are not a big fans of sparkling wines and they're just building their palate to enjoy sparkling wines, they start their journey with Prosecco because it's a little bit more easier to appreciate. Muscat Blanc or Moscato, again, certain grape varieties in different parts of the world have a different name, even though they come from the same grape variety. Moscato, this is actually a very ancient grape variety. A lot of the table grapes you guys buy are actually of a Moscato clone, and they can actually exist in pink, red, and red color. So white, pink, and red Moscato grape exist. We produce some sparkling sweet wines like Moscato di Asti. We can produce some dessert wines from it. Sometimes we can produce like a drier style, regular still wines, but it's generally done in the wines that are sweet and with a lot of aromatics. As you can see, pear, mandarin, orange, orange blossom. These are typical aromas of Moscato. And then we have typical Italian grape varieties like Gavi. We have things like Soave. In Italy, those grape varieties are often hidden by the name of the area. So Soave is actually not a grape variety. The grape variety is Garganega, the same as we find in Italian red variety called Sangiovese. The name of the area is called Chianti. A lot of people call Chianti as a grape variety, but actually Chianti is produced from a grape variety called Sangiovese. So this gets a little bit more tricky when we get to Italy. Red varieties, the most common one and one of the most ancient one as well is Pinot Noir. So it's kind of like a, we can say a mother or a father of other varieties. So Pinot Noir is a red variety that over time evolved, produced a lot of different clones, and sometimes it changed so completely that maybe it lost its color and turned into a variety called Pinot Blanc or Pinot Gris. So Pinot Gris takes its name from the grayish color that we have on the skins of the grapes, but they all derive from the mother variety called Pinot Noir. And the Pinot Noir generally prefers cooler climate. That's why it has much higher acidity, it has less color, it has less flavor compared to Cabernet, and it produces wines which are lower on alcohol and higher in acidity and less on tannins. And generally the flavor profile will be your cranberry, cherry, a lot of red fruit, and sometimes with use of oak and some age, we start getting more complexity. We're getting a little bit more aromas of cloves and mushroom, and maybe some oak and toast and vanilla. Gamay, typical variety found in Beaujolais. The fame of Beaujolais is done for this festival that they have in third week of November, when just after a third week after the harvest, or a few weeks after the harvest, they take the young, generally from the young vines, they make a very young wine that doesn't age much, it doesn't mature much in a stainless steel tanks or bottles. It's a very fresh and young, vibrant wine. The interesting part of it, it's actually the Beaujolais Nouveau, which is the festival, and the wine takes its name from the festival, is actually it's actually much lesser quality wine that Beaujolais actually produces. They actually produce wines that can age and mature quite a long time. But because of the fame of this festival, they actually now sell more of this young Beaujolais Nouveau style of wines than they produce of the quality Grand Cru and Beaujolais Village styles of wines. So even though they could produce more, it's just not much of a demand for this high quality. Everybody wants to drink this very young, fresh wine just because of the fame for it. Barbera is the grape variety found in Italy. We also find it a little bit in Argentina. It's also a variety that prefers cooler climate, so produces wines that are a little bit heavier than Pinot Noir, but definitely much softer than Cabernet or Sangiovese. And it's kind of known for its high acidity. We have Pinotage. So this is in some way a native variety to South Africa. What's interesting about it is it's a close relative to Pinot Noir, and it's actually something that was created. So they take two different species of, or two different grape varieties, and they mix the DNA to produce a new variety. And this is actually often happens either naturally or actually can happen in laboratories, and they can actually create new varieties by blending the DNAs and create a new plant. So there are varieties like this in the world. The reason why we're doing this is to create varieties that can perform well in more difficult climates to produce wine. So for example, in the areas of Canada, when it's too cold, they take a variety like Riesling and they blend and they clone it with another variety and they produce something that's called Vidal. So this is not blending of the wine itself, it's blending of the DNA of the vine itself to produce a new plant that can grow well in a difficult area. And Pinotage is one of them. It became kind of a native thing to South Africa, and it's actually a clone of Pinot Noir and Cinsault. And then dominant flavors are this kind of black cherry and blackberry, and it often has this kind of a barbecue smoke aroma to it. Grenache and Garnacha, the same name, the same grape variety, but slightly different name in different countries. We find this in France, and this name is typically found in Spain. Produces fantastic rosé wines, as I mentioned, but also great reds that can age very well. For example, Chateauneuf du Pape is the famous wine that the best wines are only made from this variety. So if it's a cheaper Chateauneuf du Pape, they will blend it with other grape varieties. If it's like 100% Grenache, it's the highest quality Chateauneuf du Pape we find, but it can also produce wines that are as simple as the rosé wines found in Spain. Sangiovese, typical variety found pretty much throughout Italy, but mostly associated with Tuscany. It produces wines like Chianti, Brunello. It produces wines. It's actually added to the super Tuscan wines like Sassicaia, Tignanello, the most expensive wines in the world these days. What's typical of Sangiovese is that it produces wines that are very high on acidity. And because of this, they can actually age very well in oak. So that's why Brunellos and some of the super Toscans age before they actually release for 4 or 5 years minimum. Merlot, kind of underrated variety these days. More people drink Cabernet. They tend to think Merlot, it's a cheaper wine than a Cabernet, even though one of the most expensive wines like Petrus found in Bordeaux is 100% made from Merlot. So wines of Petrus are generally often sold for higher price than a typical Cabernet found in Bordeaux, like Chateau Margaux or Lafite, which have more of that Cabernet Sauvignon in them. The typical flavor of Merlot, it's that sugary plum and a lot of red fruits. So it's a little bit softer than the Cabernet. Tempranillo, as I mentioned, variety found mostly in Spain. It produces wines of Rioja very often. It loves being aged in oak. And often we find this designation of the time the wine is spent in an oak barrel by either calling the wine Roble, Crianza, Reserva, or Gran Reserva. So this would determine how long the wine has been spending in an oak barrel before it's released. Syrah and Shiraz, the same thing. The difference between Syrah, Shiraz, and, for example, Cabernet, because they are both varieties that produce wines that are have a lot of dark fruit flavors, so a lot of blueberry, plum, black currants, is that Syrah tend to have this kind of peppercorn style notes, so it's very peppery. It doesn't have as much of that kind of minty leaf notes, which, for example, Cabernet Sauvignon has. Malbec, generally found in Argentina. A little bit softer than Cabernet, produces wines with a lot of blueberry, red plum, and vanilla. And it's a little bit softer on acidity compared to Syrah or Cabernet. Cabernet Sauvignon, as I mentioned, variety that produces wines that can age very well in oak. It's very fruity. It's very approachable. It can produce wines that can age well, but also can produce wines that are drinkable when they're young as well. So this is why it's so popular these days, because you can produce a very nice, cheap, young Cabernet that just tastes delicious when it's young and fruity. Zinfandel and Primitivo are varieties we found either in southern part of Italy or in California. It's the same grape variety, produces wines that are very high alcohol, low on acidity, and very dark fruit flavors. Sometimes they even kind of has this very marmalade style fruit notes, as well as this kind of a very spicy aromas to it. And then we have things that were called blend. So this is a typical style of wines found in Rhone. These are generally a blend of Grenache, Syrah, Merbet. All of these different grape varieties fall into this category. And Bordeaux blend, again, we're blending Cabernet, we're blending Merlot, we're blending Cabernet Franc, we're blending Petit Verdot, we're blending Malbec. All of this will be blended together, and that's what's going to be a style of Cabernet blend. And we're getting a little bit of every single aspect of the variety that we mentioned before into a one wine. Okay, we're getting into the time of questions and answers. So if I can ask John if he's available, maybe we have some questions already posted on the chat.
Go ahead, John.
All right, first off, is there any question from the audience?
I think Revi have a question. Come, Revi. No? Okay, anybody else? Jeffrey, maybe, Jeffrey. Okay, don't ask her, ask him. Come.
Don't be afraid of asking questions. This is a great time to do so. I know during the presentation you might have had some questions straight away, but it's hard to kind of stop the presentation and answer them directly. But if you have questions now, there's never a stupid question. There is never a question that shouldn't be asked. If you're not sure about something, if you would like me to repeat something, maybe please ask right now. I'll be happy to answer.
Stand up first. Cindy will. Okay, we have one that will ask you a question.
Okay.
Tadi itu apa kayak tadi itu Chardonnay itu kan kayak banyak gitu di tempat-tempatnya kan. Itu berarti di setiap wine itu harus ada nama tepatnya dong. Itu gimana cara bedainnya?
How to differentiate?
I don't want to.
It's okay. No, it's fine.
Oh no.
It's
You
how
don't
to
have to.
differentiate the Chardonnay from the label. How to differentiate Chardonnay Chardonnay from the label.
Chardonnay. Yang mana?
Oh, this one.
Both.
Both. Good evening, sir. My name is Cindy.
Hello.
I want to ask about how to differentiate Chardonnay from the label, because in every countries there's a Chardonnay varieties of grape. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. So very good question. So how do we know the style of Chardonnay that is produced? So this is what I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation when we talked about not only the understanding of the label, but since the Chardonnay is such a common grape variety found in the world, it can be grown in different climates. So the easiest way to first answer what type of Chardonnay we are dealing with is to know where the wine is coming from. So for example, if the wine is coming from Champagne, in Champagne they often use Chardonnay. We know it's a sparkling wine, so it comes from a cooler climate, so we know it's going to be a Chardonnay. It's going to be high on acidity. It's done to be a Champagne, so it's going to be done to be a sparkling wine that is high on acidity, less on alcohol, and generally produced to be quite crisp and refreshing. For example, if we find a Chardonnay found in California, we're seeing a complete difference because we're getting into a much warmer climate. So I'll open the Chardonnay here. So as you see, this one grape variety can be produced in all those different climates. So knowing where the wine is coming from, first of all, will be a good hint. So if you know the wine comes from Champagne, you know it comes from a cooler climate. So you already know what to expect from it. If you know the wine, a Chardonnay comes from, for example, a central part of Italy, we call this a moderate climate. So this is what you would expect from that specific Chardonnay. And if it comes from a continental style of like Australia or California, this is what you would expect from this same Chardonnay. So depending where it's grown and what it says on the label, if it says a Chardonnay produced in California, or Chardonnay produced in Burgundy, or Chardonnay produced in Champagne, we already have a little bit of understanding of what to expect from it based on climate. Then we can find out what the process of Chardonnay we use to produce it. So for example, when I was mentioning about the label, as you can see here, we know that this wine is called unoaked. So we know that the flavor of Chardonnay is not going to be affected by the use of oak barrel. However, sometimes the wine will be called oaked or barrique fermented, or maybe we would say aged. So you know the wine is now developing. So from a typical peach or nectarine, we might start getting more aromas and flavors of dried fruit. So the wine generally, when it's young and fresh, it tastes of fresh fruit, right? Like the best way to compare it is a plum or a strawberry, right? So if the wine is young, it would taste of very fresh, like straight away taken from the bush strawberries or plums. When the wine is, or mango, right? If it's a white wine, if it's aging for a little bit of time, or maybe it's fermented in oak barrels, it starts to affect that type of flavor profile of fruit, and we start getting more maybe a jammy, style of strawberry jam, or we might get a marmalade from like a nectarine, or peach jam or peach chutney, this kind of more cooked fruit flavor. And then wine, when it's really old, we start getting more of this dried fruit flavors. So raisins, prunes. So this is how the wine gets affected with time. So knowing the vintage of the Chardonnay, we already kind of know what to expect from it. If the vintage of Chardonnay is 2020, we know we're not probably going to get raisins or prunes or dried mango or dried peach, right? We're going to get more of the fresh fruit. But if the vintage of Chardonnay is 2012 or 2013, we already know that this wine has probably spent some time before it was released, and we can expect more of the cooked fruit or dried fruit flavors. And then maybe if they used oak, we maybe get a little bit more vanilla, a little bit more caramel, a little bit more butteriness to it. So this is probably the best way to understand it. Look at the climate, look at geography, where the wine is located, and that would tell you in which climate it's grown, and then try to look for the hints on the label. Another hint could be, for example, California, the Chardonnay tend to have even 15% alcohol. So it's going to be will have a very full body kind of taste, as well as the aromas and flavors should be a little bit more pronounced compared to a Burgundy style Chardonnay, which comes from a cooler climate. So it's going to have maybe 12% of alcohol.
Okay, Andrew, we have another question.
Yes.
Are you ready? You want to have a drink first, maybe?
I'm okay. I've been talking a lot. I know.
Okay, before everybody, before the next question, I will just ask the question from all the ladies from here. The question is, are you single?
I'm not. I'm sorry.
This is a
No longer. No longer.
okay. No more chance. Okay, now everybody can sleep.
No,
okay.
ma'am, can I ask you a question, please?
Oh,
it's
where is he?
No, he's online, I think.
Yeah, can you hear my voice, Mr. Andrew?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. First of all, I would like to say thank you for taking your time. Yeah, you spend say almost 2 hours, but then said you might be losing 2 hours something. I don't know. No, yeah. First of all, thank you very much for taking your time. And okay, then I've been in the hotel business, but then in Indonesia for sure, yeah. But I don't have any knowledge of wine. I just like to have the martini rosso, and then sometimes the the red wine. Then maybe if I have the steak, say, yeah, then what wine is good to have with a steak? That's number one. Number two, and what wine is good to have with seafood, for example? Could you, a silly question, but thank you very much for answering my question then, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. This is a good question, and trust me, my time spent with you, it's always productive. I'm always pleased to share my time. It's never wasted, and actually gives me a lot of fun and a lot of enjoyment sharing my passion and the knowledge with you. So the question you ask, it's actually a very broad question, and it's part of the second part when I talk about wine. Maybe we'll be hosting another event which I will go a little bit more in depth in actually wine pairing, because wine pairing is one of the most interesting part of our job as a sommeliers or people in the industry, how to pair perfectly food and wine. This is something that I'm learning every day, trying different foods and see how they work well with certain wines. But there are certain rules that we learn over the time, and this is something we cover through in the next session. But to quickly answer your question, what wine goes well with a steak? One of the rules we want to kind of obey with pairing food and wine is to match the protein that we normally have with the steak with the tannins found in the wine. So the idea of it is, if we were to take a red wine that is very low on tannins, like a Pinot Noir, and a steak which is very high on protein, the wine would disappear. It would have to be a very extremely heavy Pinot Noir to even withstand the flavors. And the reason for it is there is a very little tannins to stick to the protein that we found in our steaks. And with that, the wine is starting to disappear. So this is what we're looking for in finding a great wine with a steak, is to find a wine that has heavier tannins, because the tannins will stick to the protein in the meat and allow the wine to still has its visibility, when you can still taste the wine, you can smell the flavors, you can taste the wine while you're enjoying the steak. So the wine doesn't disappear. And the best way to find out which wine has the most tannins is what I mentioned before. The tannins comes from the skin of the grapes. So the thicker the skins, the more tannins we have in the wine. And also, in the skins of the grapes, we find our color in the wine. So the deeper the color of the wine, the darker the wine is, we expect more tannins. So generally, the darker, the heavier the wine, like Cabernet, Syrah, Malbec, are generally fantastic wines to pair with the steaks because they have higher concentration of tannins. And for seafood, generally, depending on the style of a seafood, it's a broad subject, right? We can have something like a lobster, which is very meaty, and depending how it's cooked, we can have it in a butter sauce, which then works very well because it's meaty, it's heavier. We want it with a heavier Chardonnay that works with the butteriness. But something like mussels or oysters, which are naturally salty, we want to pair with something that has higher acidity, or maybe has a little bit sweetness. So something like a Sauvignon Blanc or Chenin Blanc or Viognier, varieties that maybe don't age in oak, but they work with saltiness in the seafood. You can actually even pair red varieties with fish. For example, like tuna, a typical fish we found here in Maldives. You can get like a very meaty tuna steak, and that can go well with a Pinot Noir or Gamay or Beaujolais. So it really depends on the texture of the food. Is the food has high protein content? Does it has a lot of saltiness? Is the food very oily? We're going to look for different types of wine. And this is something that I cover on the next session, the specific rules that, we pair tannins with protein, we pair acidity with oiliness, and those kind of things, and I explain it by detail.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew. What a thorough answer. Then I got 150 mark score then for this, if I could answer this to my question. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Papi. So Andrew, that's Papi. It's a part of our family as well here in our university here in BTP.
Fantastic.
And then now we have the next question. It comes from one of our students as well. Go ahead, please. Time is yours.
So good evening, Mr. Andrews.
Yes, I could hear you.
Okay. So my name is Jeffrey, and I want to ask you about the tannin that you mentioned in the early part of your session. Does it really affects the color? I'm sorry, I may repeat my question. Does tannin really just affect the color and the deep flavor of the wine? That's all, I think.
Okay. So as I mentioned, so when we take a look at the grape, as you know, so what affects the flavor profile and or how intense the flavor of the wine will be, and how much tannins we'll have in the wine and how much color we'll have in the wine, will be affected by the thickness of the skins. So the skin of the grape has different thickness depending on different grape variety. So for example, as I mentioned, Pinot Noir has a very thin skin. So from that skin, we cannot extract too much of flavor. We cannot extract too much of tannins, and we're also not going to extract too much of the color. So all of those aspects are affected by the thickness of the skins, as well as how much we press on a grape. So if you remember, when we looked at the production of the red wine, after the wine is crushed, we can either pressed very heavily on the skins, extracting as much tannins. So we can have a Cabernet that has a very light color, maybe a little bit darker than a Pinot Noir, because we only crush the grapes and gently press them. So with that, we're not going to extract too much tannins as well. But then a Cabernet we extract and pressed on the skins very heavily. We get more flavor, we get more tannins with it, and then we get more color. Also, we might leave the skins for a little bit longer while the wine is fermenting, even extracting even more tannins and more flavor. So the tannins is something that is associated with the skins of the grapes and the thickness of it, and also how we extract them from the skins. However, the tannins is something that are important in wine, but also a lot of young wines are so tannic that are almost undrinkable. They are just too thick, too bitter. And in order to smoothen the tannins, make them a little bit more approachable, we take that wine and we put it in oak barrels. So oak barrels allow the wine then to soften over time. So the tannins are there, but they're not as harsh, right? And that softens the wine, allows the wine to mature very well. So the tannins are kind of thing we want because they work well with food, but we don't want them to be too bitter and too heavy. And with help comes with the use of oak barrels, which smoothen the tannins, make them a little bit more rounder.
All right, thank you for the answer, Andrew. There's another question from one of our students too, if you would.
Good evening, sir. I am Ferdi. I want to ask something.
Okay.
Is there any suggestion for us to become sommelier like you? Thank you.
You guys can get even higher and better than me. So all you have to do is just basically not only just study, because I know books can be sometimes not even difficult, but can be boring. But you can get a lot of information about wine from books. But actually, the most you learn from experience. So working in a restaurant, working in a hospitality establishment, learning from others, learning from each other, you learn about the wine. Tasting of the wine is very important aspect, but it's not crucial. Actually, we have here in Maldives a Maldivian sommelier, which has the same level, advanced level in wine, the same as myself. Which is a kind of a unique thing here in Maldives. As you might know, it's mostly a Muslim country, which means there people here don't drink any alcohol. So for a Maldivian sommelier to gain such a high knowledge, his knowledge was based on his actually knowledge from the books and from learning from other sommeliers. And the tasting part, he actually was able to learn all of this from just aroma, just taking the glass of wine, smelling it, taking a sip, but not actually drinking it and spitting it out, and getting all the flavors he needed to learn about the wine from just this process. So it was much harder for him, and even though he still achieved this very high result. So it's even possible with all these restrictions to become a sommelier. So I think everybody has a chance to get to the highest levels. It's not easy to become a master sommelier. There is only over almost 300 of them in the world. That's what they call this highest exam, the most difficult in the world. However, with that being said, as I mentioned, think about all those countries like China and now Indonesia and Philippines. These are highly populated countries that starting to get attracted into wine. And with that, with all this industry gaining more reputation and people starting asking questions about wine, we will need people who are knowledgeable about wine. So you guys have an opportunity right now to learn about wine and then share your knowledge with others, because this is only going to grow in your country and around the world. You can see how it changed over the time. People used to only talk about France, Italy, and Spain regarding to wine, and these were the only countries really consuming wine as well. Now we have countries like China, Lebanon, we have countries of New Zealand, Chile, Mexico, they're all producing wine. So even Thailand is producing wine. So there is a great opportunity for skilled sommeliers. This career it's definitely a growing career. And especially in your countries when there is not that many sommeliers yet, this is a great opportunity for all of you. So I urge all of you to seek information, go on courses, go on tastings, and learn as much as you can.
Okay, thank you, sir, for your answer.
Thank you.
All right. Test the mics now. Okay. We have multiple questions from the participant at home. I will read the first one. Hi, good afternoon, Mr. Andrew. Thank you for your time and such great presentation. I want to ask you about what is the oldest wine that you ever tasted and what was it like? And also a little bit out of topic, could you describe the role of sommelier and how someone becomes one?
The oldest wine I've ever tasted. Oh wow. It was probably one of the some famous Bordeaux and Champagnes. Some of like really nice vintages, probably in a kind of produced in the 70s, like 76, or even the some of the Bordeaux, the very famous vintage of 82. So this was kind of a wines that I had a chance to taste. And with that, I need to say that, and this kind of answers also the importance of the sommelier business. And you never really have you never really learn everything, and there's always opportunity to kind of go back to learning. I want to kind of share the story with working actually in Australia recently. I went back into, even though I ran restaurants and resorts before, I went back to working in an actual restaurant with very good sommeliers. And that restaurant was making a lot of money for the business, just because it has a very high quality sommeliers working there. And actually, people were coming to this restaurant not only for the for the food, but actually for the knowledge of the sommeliers. That restaurant was known for having the presence of the sommeliers. So more and more hotels, resorts are bringing those kind of sommeliers to the resorts and to the restaurants. This career is becoming very important to generate more revenue for the places. And with that type of customer, when people want to spend and are willing to spend more money on the wine, you guys have opportunity to try a lot of different wines. A lot of the wines that I've tasted, I never had to pay for. And this is the best part of the career we have, that it allows you to actually, it's a very common thing to open a bottle of wine, and as a sommelier, somebody who is experienced, actually taste the wine prior before you give it to your customer. So this is the best way to learn about some really old vintages of wine, because you open it for your customer and you have the ability to taste it and actually build your memory kind of on all those different types of wines.
All right, thank you, Andrew. There's one last question. It's from a person, but there's actually two questions. It's from one of our students. Her name is Indah. She's asking, like you said that in some places produce lower quality of grapes, and of course of that it will produce lower quality of wine. How to make a better quality of wine from a lower quality of grapes? And she's also asking which fermentation of wine is better? Is it the wood barrel or stainless steel one?
Okay, so I'll quickly answer the second question first. There's no better wines, either oak or stainless steel. Depending on the type of grape variety and what we want to achieve from it, we choose a specific way of maturing the wine. So if you have a Sauvignon Blanc or a Riesling and you put it in an oak barrel, you might destroy the freshness and fruitiness. So the oak barrel is not going to be beneficial. There are Sauvignon Blancs that are aged in oak and they perform well, but it was produced to be that way, and it's completely different to normally what people expect Sauvignon Blanc to be. However, this also adds to the cost. So if you have a very cheap, very young vines of, maybe not cheap, but very young vines of Chardonnay, you're not going to produce a very complex wine. You're also not going to put it in an oak barrel because you're not going to get the most out of it. So there's no point adding something that is very expensive like oak barrel to something that it wasn't intended to be produced as a high quality wine. So then to answer the questions, can you produce? Well, you cannot produce high quality wine from terrible grapes. However, you can definitely produce a terrible wine from high quality grapes if you don't know what you're doing. However, these days we have much more knowledge as well as equipment to produce very good quality grapes as well as to produce very good quality wine. We can actually, there's a big science behind it, and there's a lot of tests being run. So a lot of the wineries are not as old as they used to be when we actually just farmers were making wine. These are generally done. A lot of wines are tested and blended in the wineries. They more look like laboratories. So a lot of the wine is being tested first in small lab samples, and then is then done in a larger scale. So these days we really can produce fantastic wines from just good grapes. But because of this, we can actually, it's very hard to make a bad wine these days, just because there is so much knowledge and so much experience and so much technology. But because there is so much great wine around the world, it's very hard to produce something exceptional. And this is why areas like Burgundy and Bordeaux and some of the best areas in the world strive in, because they can produce exceptional wines.
All right, thank you, Andrew. That is the last of the questions. So we'll officially close the question and answer session. That's it from the seminar today. Before we close the seminar, we would like to take a photo with you. So the participant, if you could, I'll go down to the podium.
Sure, sure.
Shall we make it full screen?
Yes.
All right, tell me if I should wave. Tell me when you're ready.
Not yet. Oh, the microphone is there. Well.
Andrew, can you hear us?
Yes. Ready for the photo?
Okay. In 5 seconds. Starting now.
I'll wave. All good? Bye. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Okay, guys. Guys, say goodbye all at the same time.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, Andrew, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day.
Should we meet for the second session, Andrew?
Hopefully, yes. I'll be happy to do another one.
Thank you.
Thank you. See ya. Bye.
Andrew, thank you so much. How was it? Was it fun? Oh, I'm muted. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? He's muted or I'm muted or who's muted? No.
Hello? Hello?
He's gone.
It's gone. Papi, can you hear us?
Of course I can, but then Andrew is. I'm afraid
Papi.
Andrew has left already. Yeah.
Papi, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, but I'm afraid that Mr. Andrew has left already. Then there is no movement anymore.
We can't hear you anymore.
Yeah, I can hear you for sure.
Oh, Papi can hear us. I think because the speaker got turned off.
Now, I can hear you, but then I'm afraid Mr. Andrew has left already. But I don't know.
He already did.